Imagine a city so imposing that its walls rose to the heavens, protecting an empire built on the blood of its enemies, a place where gold and violence went hand in hand, where they believed themselves to be kings' gods, and where the fear was the basis of power. This was Nineveh, the jewel of the Empire Assyrian, the largest metropolis in its time, but also an epicenter of corruption, oppression, and rituals that defy all moral logic. Located on the shores of the river Tigris, in what is now Iraq, Nineveh was not just a city, but a declaration of absolute power. Its kings. They built temples, palaces, and hanging gardens that dazzled the travelers from all over the known world. But behind that splendor, the reality was dark and brutal. Its inhabitants lived under a regime of terror, where the violence was not only a tool of control, but a public spectacle. The army Assyrian was feared for his cruelty. Impalements, beheadings, and enslavement were practices common, and anyone who challenged the power of the king paid with his life. But there was another side of Nineveh, even more disturbing. In the temples of the goddess Ishtar, the deity of love and war, were practiced rituals that seem strange to us today, unimaginable. Women, many of them against their will, were forced to participate in the sacred prostitution, an act that, according to the priests, guaranteed the prosperity of the city. It didn't matter his origin, neither his will. All should undergo these rites at least once in his life. What for the Assyrians was a spiritual practice. For many, women meant humiliation, abuse, and resignation. However, Nineveh was not only known for its brutality, but also for its dramatic fall. For those who lived in the antiquity, the destruction of this city, it seemed a divine punishment. Prophets like Jonah, Nahum, and Isaiah predicted your destiny with centuries in advance, and when finally the city fell, did not remain stone upon stone. What once was a glorious empire ended up plunged into the dust, forgotten by the history for centuries. As could a civilization so powerful disappear from the night at tomorrow? Were they the warnings from the prophets one simple coincidence, or a prediction exact of Nineveh's fate? And what can we learn today from its rise and fall? In the next few minutes, we will travel back in time to discover the secrets of this metropolis, ancient. We will explore its wonders, architectural, its ruthless system of government, the most disturbing religious rituals, and finally, the collapse that the condemned to oblivion. Stay until the end, because the story of Nineveh not only reveals the fate of a city, but also could be a reflection of our own society. To understand the power of Nineveh, it is necessary to transport us to a time in the one that the cities were not simple settlements, but symbols of dominance, greatness, and in many cases, of brutality. Nineveh was not the exception. It was one of the most advanced metropolises of the ancient world, a center of power that embodied the glory of the Empire Assyrian. But behind its colossal walls and its awesome architecture, too, hid a dark side that would end up marking his destiny. Nineveh was located in a strategic point on the shore of the river Tigris, in what is now Iraq. This site not only provided access to essential resources, such as water and land fertile, but converted in a key point for trade and military expansion. It was not just another city in the Empire Assyrian, it was his heart, its political and cultural center, the place where they were taken the decisions that affected the entire known world. The king Sennacherib was who brought Nineveh to its maximum splendor in the 7th century BC. Until then, the empire there had other capitals, such as Assur. But this monarch decided that his legacy would be captured in the city that he same would transform in the greatest of all. The walls of Nineveh were an architectural feat unprecedented. They extended over 12 kilometers in perimeter and were reinforced with watchtowers and gates monumental. It is said that its walls were so thick that in the upper part could carry several war chariots at the same time. But if there was something that really proved the wealth and power of Sennacherib, was his palace. known as the Palace Without Rival. This complex counted with more than 80 rooms, all decorated with reliefs in stone that narrated the military exploits of the king. In these representations, one could see the Assyrians conquering cities, torturing prisoners, and exhibiting his dominion over the subjugated peoples. It was a visual warning to anyone who dared to challenge the authority of the monarch. Sennacherib also carried out infrastructure projects never seen before. Built a system of canals and aqueducts that transported water from the mountains up to the city. Thanks to this system, Nineveh had water potable in abundance and could maintain its vast gardens, which some historians suggest may have having been the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. After the death of Sennacherib, his grandson Ashurbanipal took the throne, and although his reign was also bloodthirsty, left a legacy of knowledge invaluable: the construction of the Library of Nineveh. Unlike other monarchs, Ashurbanipal not only dedicated himself to war, but also promotion learning. His library contained more than 30,000 clay tablets with texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, literature, and religion. Some of these texts were copies of even older writings, which allowed much of the knowledge Sumerian and Babylonian were preserved to this days. One of the most important discoveries of this library were the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story that, to the surprise of many, bears similarities with the biblical story of the Great Flood. However, while Nineveh expanded and accumulated wealth, it also grew his thirst for power and its brutality. The Empire Assyrian was not characterized by diplomacy. His domain was based in terror, their armies. They were feared for their ferocity, and their methods of punishment were extremely cruel. Impalements, flayings, and mutilations were practices common, and the captured enemies were forced to parade in chains before being executed publicly. The rulers of Nineveh believed that their power was eternal, that their city never would fall. But what they didn't know was that while they built monuments to glorify themselves too were sowing the seeds of your own destruction. Because behind all that opulence and grandeur existed a system of oppression and violence that sooner or later would end up becoming in against him. But before talking about the fall of Nineveh, it is crucial to understand how it worked his society and what manner the religion played a central role in his social structure, leading to practices that we would consider unthinkable today. Live in Nineveh was to witness the splendor of an empire in its peak, but also it meant being subject to a rigid social structure where power was concentrated in an elite relentless. In the pinnacle of the pyramid was he king, an almost divine figure whose word was law. His authority had no limits, and his presence was surrounded by an aura of terror and respect. To his around was the nobility, composed of generals, priests, and high officials who enjoyed privileges unattainable for the rest of the population. Beneath them were the artisans, merchants, and scribes, the class average of Nineveh. They were people with true level of education and economic stability, but still subject to the designs of the monarch. Despite contributing to the functioning of the city, with his job in the construction, the administration and commerce, its welfare depended entirely at the whims of the nobility. A decree of the king could elevate a man to success or condemn him to misery in a moment. Below in the social hierarchy were the peasants and workers who formed the majority of the population. They were those who cultivated the land. They built the monuments and secured a supply of food and resources to the city. Despite its importance for the economy, they lived in extremely precarious conditions, subject to abusive taxes and severe punishments if they did not comply with their obligations. But the worse position occupied the slaves, people reduced to mere objects of property. They were prisoners of war, debtors who had not been able to pay what they owed, or simply victims of a ruthless system that relegated to the harder and more degrading jobs. They were used in the constructions, in the battlefields as cannon fodder, and in the palaces as servants. Their lives had no value to their masters, and their deaths generated neither the slightest remorse. The women regardless of their social position, were subjected to a patriarchal system that considered inferior to the men. Since his birth, their destiny was to serve their husbands, obey their parents, and reproduce the offspring that would perpetuate a lineage. In the nobility, some could exert influence through their husbands or children, but the most lived in the shadow of male power. Their rights were limited, and any violation of established rules could be punished with the death or the slavery. But if there was an aspect of the Ninevite society that truly demonstrated his brutality, was the army. The military campaigns were not simple conquests, but spectacles of terror calculated to instill fear in their enemies. The Assyrians not only defeated their adversaries, annihilated with terrifying ferocity. They flayed the prisoners, impaled the rebels on the entrances of the conquered cities, and exhibited the heads of defeated leaders on stakes as a warning. In the reliefs of the palaces, you can see images of soldiers tearing the tongue of their victims, cutting off hands and feet, and piling up bodies in large pits common. Terror was not only directed at the external enemies, but also to the own population. Any attempt at rebellion within the city was immediately suffocated with exemplary punishments. Snitching was encouraged, and a simple accusation could take a person to the execution without right to defense. The king and his generals maintained control through a network of informants and a constant demonstration of its cruelty. However, there was an element in the Ninevite society that went further of military power or social rigidity: the religion. In Nineveh, the beliefs were not just a spiritual matter, but a tool of control that influenced every aspect of daily life. And within that religious system, there was a practice that still today go on being a source of debate and controversy: the sacred prostitution, a custom that subjected women to a terrifying fate in the temples of the goddess Ishtar. Life in Nineveh was deeply marked by the religion. Temples were not only centers of worship, but also the epicenter of political, economic, and social life. The beliefs were not optional, but an obligation imposed since the birth. The gods, Assyrians. They were seen as powerful and capricious beings, capable of granting victories or unleash calamities if they were not duly worshipped. Among them, one of the most venerated, and at the same time most feared deities was Ishtar, the goddess of love, the fertility, and war. His cult was one of the most influential in the empire, but also the most disturbing. In the heart of Nineveh, stood imposing temples dedicated to Ishtar, where rituals were carried out that today would result unthinkable. In these sanctuaries, the worship of the goddess was not limited to simple prayers and offerings. It required the participation of the women in a system of sacred prostitution. It was believed that surrendering in these rituals was a religious duty that guaranteed the blessing of the goddess and assured the prosperity of the city. However, for many women, this was not an act of voluntary devotion, but an obligation imposed by religious authorities. The youths were taken to the temples at different stages of their lives, some from the adolescence, to fulfill with this divine service. Indeed, they were expected to be offered to strangers within the sacred precincts as part of a fertility rite. The priests claimed that this act strengthened the link between the people and the goddess, and that in return, Ishtar granted protection, military victories, and abundance in the harvests. The reality, however, was much bleaker. The system did not distinguish between classes, social. Both women of origin, noble as well as peasants, could be called to serve in the temples. For some, this was a duty tax since its birth. For others, a sentence imposed on them as a form of payment for debts or as punishment for defying established norms. Although the history has tried to soften the image of these rituals, the stories of the time show that many women were forced to participate against their will, without possibility of refusal. In the clay tablets that have been recovered from the ruins of Nineveh are found inscriptions that describe the rituals with details chilling. It is mentioned how the priestesses of Ishtar supervised the ceremonies and guaranteed that each woman fulfilled with their sacred destiny. Foreigners who arrived at the city also could participate in these rituals, since it was believed that the more it spread the devotion to the goddess, the greater it would be his power. This system not only benefited the temples from the religious point of view, but also economic. The priests accumulated wealth through the offerings and donations made by those who participated in the rituals. Some ancient texts indicate that the temples of Ishtar, they came to possess enormous fortunes, comparable with those of the palace's royals. In this way, the religion and power were intertwined in a way inseparable, ensuring that the popular beliefs served as a tool of control over the population. It was no coincidence that one of the main functions of the kings Assyrians out present themselves as intermediaries between the gods and the people. Each monarch ensured have received his right to govern by divine mandate, reinforcing the idea that any challenge to your authority was, in reality, a blasphemy. Wars were not fought solely for territorial ambition, but under the justification that the gods they demanded the expansion of the empire. Enemies were not seen simply as political adversaries, but as sinners who should be punished for defying the divine order. Religion. In Nineveh, it was not just a matter of faith, but a mechanism of domination that permeated all aspects of life. The brutality of the army, the oppression of the weakest, and the submission of the women were not seen as injustices, but as fundamental parts of the cosmic balance imposed by the gods. But neither, not even the protection of Ishtar. He was able to save Nineveh when fate finally knocked on their door. For years, prophets warned that the city would fall, that his corruption and excesses would not go unpunished. At first, no one that took in serious. After all, Nineveh seemed unbeatable, protected by its imposing walls and backed by its powerful army. But when the fall came, it was so swift and devastating that many they believed that it had really been a divine punishment. The history of Nineveh was about to change forever, and with she, the one of all the empire Assyrian, in the midst of the greatness of Nineveh, where the kings were proclaimed gods, and the brutality was part of the natural order, an unexpected warning arose. A stranger, arrived at the city with a message that challenged everything the Ninevites believed. His name was Jonah, and according to the scriptures was sent by God with a clear mission to warn Nineveh of its imminent destruction if they did not change their ways. The biblical story tells that Jonah did not want to obey the divine order in a beginning. I knew that Nineveh was not a place where a prophet would be good received. The reputation of the Assyrians were known in all the lands, and few dared to challenge them. Therefore, he tried flee, embarking in opposite direction. But according to the history, God did not allow his escape, and, after a storm on the high seas and being swallowed by a big fish, Jonah finally accepted his destination and traveled to Nineveh. When arrived, his message, it was brief and terrifying. In 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. There was no promises of mercy, no long explanations, just a direct sentence that shook the city. What happened after it was unexpected. Instead of ignoring him or executing him for blasphemy, as was common with those who spoke against the kingdom, the people of Nineveh heard. From the humblest to the own king, everyone showed repentance. They dressed with rough clothes, covered their heads with ashes, and fasted in sign of humiliation. Even the animals were included in this act of collective supplication. The Bible states that God saw this change of attitude and, in an act of compassion, decided not to destroy the city. For Jonah, however, this was a source of frustration. He did not want Nineveh to be saved. He knew the history of violence of the Assyrians and feared that in the future they would return to their former customs. And indeed, it was what happened. Nineveh's repentance did not last forever. With time, the city returned to his arrogance, his brutality, and its practices ungodly. the fear of divine punishment vanished, and the ancient traditions, they returned. The warning had been heard, but it was not enough to change the essence of an empire built on war and submission. Was so when other prophets began to announce that this time the destruction would not be avoided. Between them, Nahum and Isaiah proclaimed that Nineveh's fate was sealed and that its end would come violently. What no one imagined how fast and brutal it would be. That collapse. The city that had defied the gods already, them men was about to disappear from the history forever. For years, prophets warned that Nineveh would fall. The city, which had once feared divine wrath and shown only brief repentance, returned to its former glory, ancient nature of cruelty and excesses. But this time there would be no second chance. Nahum, one of the prophets who foretold his fall, he described with details chilling the fate that awaited the Assyrian capital. His words were clear. Nineveh is a city of blood, full of lies and plunder. Without end is yours predation. Isaiah, another prophet, also advanced his fall, ensuring that the power of the Assyrians would not last forever. However, for the inhabitants of the city, these warnings seemed ridiculous. Nineveh was protected by walls impenetrable, an army feared by all nations, and a wealth that seemed inexhaustible. Nothing indicated that it could be destroyed. But fate had already was on the move, and in year 612 BC the prophecy was fulfilled. The Babylonians, Medes and Scythians, historical enemies of the Assyrians, saw the opportunity to end with the city that both they had terrorized. For months they besieged Nineveh, preventing the entry of food and weakening its population. But even then, the Ninevites trusted in which its walls would resist. What they did not foresee was that the own nature would play in against him. Historical accounts suggest that a flash flood weakened the defenses of the city. The waters of the river Tigris, which for centuries had been the source of life of Nineveh, became in his worst enemy. The flood destroyed part of the walls, leaving an access open for the invading armies. The enemies they entered without mercy, looting and destroying everything in its path past. The Assyrians, accustomed to sowing terror, now it were experiencing in his own flesh. It is said that the last king of Nineveh, instead of surrendering, gathered all his riches within his palace, and him turned on fire, preferring die among the flames before being captured. The city, it burned for days. Its temples were looted, its inhabitants massacred, and its monuments reduced to rubble. What once was the most powerful metropolis on earth was reduced to ruins. The few survivors were taken as slaves, and the name of Nineveh disappeared from the history. For centuries, its existence it was forgotten, until archaeologists in the 19th century rediscovered their remains, confirming that the city mentioned in the Bible and in ancient tablets had actually existed. The fall of Nineveh not only marked the end of the Empire Assyrian, but left a lesson that resonates to this days. None empire, no matter how powerful it may seem, is eternal. Arrogance, violence, and contempt for the justice always end having a price. And when the fall comes, it makes in a way relentless, no matter how high they are the walls that try stop her. The story of Nineveh is a testimony of the rise and fall of the civilizations. For centuries, it was the symbol of absolute power, a city that dominated with an iron fist, imposing his will over nations whole. But with the time, the corruption, the violence, and the arrogance that condemned to oblivion, what once was the most feared and powerful metropolis in the antique ended up buried under the sands of the time, until the point that for centuries his existence was considered a myth. The fall of Nineveh was not just the result of a war. It was the collapse of a system built on terror and exploitation. Their own excesses they took to their ruin, and when fate finally brought her down, reached, nor its walls, neither his army were able to save her. The prophets had warned her destruction, but the city ignored the signs until it was too late. Today, looking towards the past, we can ask ourselves, how many times in the history have we seen similar patterns? How many civilizations they have believed themselves to be invincible, only to fall by themselves. Mistakes did Nineveh make? Arrogance of power, the extreme inequality, the violence as a tool of domination. These are elements that were not left behind in the past, but are still present in the modern world. Nineveh leaves us with a clear lesson. None society can sustain itself indefinitely if it is based in abuse and injustice. At some point, every empire that believes itself eternal finds its end. And when falls, it does so abruptly and irreversibly. Do you think that the story of Nineveh has parallels with the world in the one we live in today? Leave us your opinion in the comment and share this video with someone who should learn about this story. And if you want to continue exploring the hidden mysteries of the past, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.